In part 1, we spoke about the path that led Diane Downs to the night of May 19th, 1983. From her strict and turbulent upbringing, to the birth of her 3 children, to the then shooting that left 1 dead and 2 fighting for their lives. We spoke about her arrival at the McKenzie Willamette Hospital and the early steps investigators took as they tried to make sense of what she had claimed had happened on Old Mohawk Road. By the end of that night, detectives had their first look at Diane's version of events and their first quiet doubts. Part 2 picks up from that point. This episode follows the unraveling of Diane's story, the mounting evidence against her, and the courtroom battle that would ultimately determine her fate. If you haven't done so already, please listen to part 1 of the Diane Downs Case. If you enjoyed these episodes, I encourage you to follow or subscribe to Criminal Interrupted on your favourite podcast app. As I've mentioned before, I'm currently focusing on this podcast full-time due to a heart condition, so every follow and review makes a huge difference. Thank you for listening and for your incredible support. This is Criminal Interrupted. By June, Assistant District Attorney Fred Hughey gathered his investigative team to assess everything they had uncovered so far. The central question was unavoidable. Was there enough evidence to arrest Diane Downs? Hughey believed she was responsible for the shooting, and his investigators agreed. But belief wasn't enough. Without the murder weapon or a witness who had actually seen her pull the trigger, the case remained vulnerable. Much of what they had collected was compelling, but still technically circumstantial, and Hughey knew that moving too quickly could jeopardize the entire prosecution. The team reviewed their evidence piece by piece. They had several .22 caliber shell casings recovered from Old Mohawk Road. They had the blood-soaked interior of Diane's red Nissan Pulsar. They had forensic analysis mapping the trajectory of the bullets, Diane's diary entries and letters, which revealed an intense emotional fixation on her former lover, and they had testimony from both Steve Downs and the ex-lover confirming that Diane had owned a .22 caliber handgun, a weapon she continued to deny ever possessing. One of the most significant findings came from forensic expert Jim Pex. After examining unfired .22 caliber cartridges found in Diane's home, Pex concluded that some of them had likely been cycled through the same gun that shot the children. It was a powerful connection, but without the gun itself, it remained open to challenge. A defense attorney could argue that the cartridges had passed through any number of similar firearms. Hughey knew that without the weapon, the forensic link would never be airtight. Investigators also began dismantling Diane's timeline. According to hospital staff, Diane arrived at McKenzie Willamette Hospital at approximately 10:48 p.m., shouting that someone had shot her children. She had left the Ploud residence around 9:45 p.m., according to Heather Ploud. For Diane's story to hold, the shooting would have needed to occur around 10:15 p.m., giving her just enough time to race to the hospital. But a witness had come forward, a man named Joseph Inham, who reported seeing a red Nissan matching Diane's car around 10:20 p.m. on Old Mohawk Road. What struck him was the speed. The car was moving extremely slowly, no more than 5 to 7 miles per hour. He said, quote, "The car wasn't being driven critically," end quote. In other words, it didn't look like someone was rushing 3 gravely injured children to the emergency room. It looked like someone driving without urgency. The district attorney's office supported Hughey's work despite the gaps, and a grand jury was convened behind closed doors. The panel wanted to hear directly from the key witnesses: Diane's former lover, Joseph Inham, Heather Ploud, forensic analyst Jim Pex, and eventually Diane herself. The secrecy of the proceedings allowed jurors to evaluate the evidence without public pressure, but it also meant that Diane had no idea how much of her story investigators had already dismantled. Meanwhile, the welfare of the surviving children became a priority. County Judge Gregory Foote ordered Christine and Danny into protective custody under the state's Child Services Bureau. For the time being, Diane was barred from seeing them. She insisted she was being treated like a criminal, but the decision came after she had threatened to remove the children from the hospital if detectives did not, quote, leave her alone, end quote. To authorities, the threat was alarming and also revealing. Danny, still bedridden and recovering from paralysis, remained under police protection until he was medically stable enough to be moved. Once released, he would join Christy in foster care. The location of Christy's placement was kept confidential, known only to a small number of officials. Investigators believed that distance and safety were essential, especially as the case against Diane continued to build. Inside the DA's office, the mood was cautious but determined. They believed they had the right suspect. They believed the evidence pointed clearly towards Diane. But belief wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed the case to withstand scrutiny. And above all, they needed to ensure that Christy and Danny were protected while the legal process moved forward. The investigation was no longer just about reconstructing what happened on Old Mohawk Road. It was about preparing for the moment when the county would have to decide whether to charge a mother with shooting her own children, and whether they had the strength of evidence to make that charge stick. As the grand jury continued calling witnesses, investigators searched for anything that might strengthen the case, especially the missing gun. But an unexpected setback hit the Lane County Sheriff's Office. Budget cuts forced widespread layoffs. State funding had dropped sharply, and the department had to let people go. Among the first was investigator Paul Alton. Soon after, Doug Welch and another of Hughie's key investigators, Kurt West, were given notice as well. In a matter of weeks, nearly everyone assigned to the Downs case was either laid off or reassigned. And the timing could not have been worse. The case was still fragile, still dependent on circumstantial evidence, and still missing the one piece that would make everything airtight. Losing the investigative team meant losing momentum, but Hughie refused to let the case stall. He pushed Welch and West to keep working until their final day, urging them to squeeze every remaining hour out of their time on the job. While the investigation strained under staffing cuts, Diane Downs was moving in the opposite direction, straight into the spotlight. By late 1983 and into early 1984, she had become a fixture in local and regional media. Reporters were drawn to her confidence, her dramatic retellings of the night, and her insistence that she was being prosecuted by authorities who couldn't find the real shooter. Some outlets were skeptical, but many were captivated. She was young, photogenic, and articulate. To certain audiences, she appeared more like a misunderstood single mother than a suspect in a brutal crime. Her resemblance to Princess Diana didn't go unnoticed as well, and some newspapers leaned into the comparison. Others, less charmed, gave her a darker nickname, quote, Princess Di, end quote. But regardless of the angle, Diane kept talking, to reporters, to cameras, to anyone who would listen. She insisted she was innocent, that she was being harassed, and that the state was out to get her. Hughie watched her media appearances closely. To him, she wasn't a princess or a victim. She was someone who created chaos wherever she went, and now she was using the press to shape public opinion. Still, he didn't try to silence her. He let her talk. Every interview, every contradiction, every dramatic flourish added to the portrait of a woman whose story didn't hold up under scrutiny. And while she spoke to the cameras, Welch and West continued to follow her movements, determined to gather whatever they could before their layoffs became official. Eventually, Diane requested a meeting with the two investigators. She framed it as an attempt to clear the air, a chance to share new information she claimed she'd withheld since the night of the shooting. Welch and West agreed, hoping she might finally reveal something useful. But as soon as the conversation began, they sensed they were being manipulated. What Diane offered wasn't new evidence, it was a new version of her story. She now claimed the shooter had called her by her name, implying that he wasn't a stranger at all, but someone she might have known. If true, This would have fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation, but to Welch and West, the claim felt rehearsed, almost theatrical. It contradicted everything she'd said before and seemed designed to stall the grand jury's process. The detective shifted tactics. What began as a conversation quickly turned into a confrontation. The interview that Anne Rule would later call, quote, the hardball session, end quote. They pressed her on every inconsistency. Why is she only mentioning this now? How would the shooter have known which road she was taking home? Was he from Oregon or Arizona? What motive would he have to kill her children? Did she really drive straight to the hospital, or did she stop somewhere first? She didn't know any of the answers. And when they asked the question they had been circling for months, whether she had shot her children because they interfered with her relationship with her lover, Diane didn't hesitate. She exploded. She called them names, cursed at them, accused them of being corrupt, and stormed out of the room. Shortly afterwards, Diane made a decision that stunned even those who had followed her case closely. She became pregnant again. Whether it was a calculated attempt to gain sympathy or a genuine effort to recreate the emotional high she associated with pregnancy, she made sure the public knew about it. In a televised interview, she explained her reasoning, quote, I got pregnant because I miss Christy, and I miss Danny, and I miss Cheryl so much. You can't replace children, but you can replace the effect they give you. They give me love, they give me satisfaction, they give me stability, they give me a reason to live, end quote. To Hughie, watching from home, the message was unmistakable. He believed she was trying to influence potential jurors to appear maternal, nurturing, incapable of violence. He saw it as a strategy, not sentiment. Meanwhile, Christy Downs was slowly recovering under the care of counsellor Paula Krogdahl. Christy had suffered a stroke after the shooting, and her speech had been severely affected, but with time and therapy, she began to talk again. Krogdahl approached the trauma carefully, avoiding direct questions about the shooting until Christy was ready. Instead, she encouraged the child to talk about her family, her home life, and her mother. Gradually, Christy revealed troubling details. She said her mother had hit her, Danny, and Cheryl lots. When Krogdahl finally asked about the night of the shooting, the night Christy called that terrible thing, the child's answers were quiet but clear. Quote, was there anyone there that night that you didn't know? No. Were Danny and Cheryl crying? No. Why wasn't Cheryl crying? Dead. End quote. After a long pause, Krogdahl asked the question that mattered the most. Quote, do you know who was shooting, Christy? I think, she began, but the words wouldn't come. Krogdahl didn't push. She let the moment pass. By early 1984, Hughie had reached a decision. Experts assured him that the evidence was strong enough, and the grand jury had been meeting for 9 months, hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses, including Diane herself. When the deliberations ended, they issued an indictment: 1 count of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of first-degree assault. On February 28, 1984, as Diane stepped out of her car in the post office parking lot, police moved in and placed her under arrest. District Attorney Pat Horton and Lane County Sheriff David Burks held a press conference shortly after Diane's arrest. Horton kept his remarks measured, emphasizing the deliberate pace of the investigation. Quote, the one thing that underscored this investigation is patient. The real battle is the courtroom. End quote. When the Eugene Register Guard reached Diane's father, Wes Fendrickson, he offered a response that was both loyal and blunt. Quote, if my daughter did it, then I believe, in fact, she should pay. But nothing can take away the love a father has for his kids. End quote. As the trial approached, Diane sought high-profile representation. She reached out to famed attorney Melvin Belly, who was intrigued by the case and willing to defend her, but only if the trial could be postponed for several months. The court refused. The schedule was set, and with Diane pregnant again, any delay risked pushing the trial even further. Too much time, too many resources, and too many people had already been invested. With Belly unavailable, Diane hired criminal defense attorney Jim Jagger, known for his straightforward, folksy courtroom style. The trial opened on May 10, 1984, in Courtroom 3 of the Lane County Courthouse, the largest courtroom in the building. The jury consisted of 9 women and 3 men. Presiding over the proceedings was Judge Gregory Foote, the same judge who had previously ordered Christy and Danny into protective custody. Young but respected, Foote was known for his fairness and his steady control of the courtroom. Spectators filled every available seat. Some were locals who had followed the case from the beginning, others were drawn by the national attention. Across the country, public opinion remained sharply divided. To some, Diane was a victim of a botched investigation. To others, she was a calculated woman who had harmed her own children. In his opening statement, Prosecutor Fred Hughey laid out the state's theory. Diane's children had stood in the way of her life she wanted with her married lover. He described the .22 caliber Ruger pistol she had purchased in Arizona, a weapon she had denied owning in Oregon, and the forensic evidence linking unfired cartridges in her home to the gun that had fired the shots. He read from her diary, highlighting her fixation on the man she believed she was destined to be with, and, to the discomfort of many in the courtroom, he read aloud a sexually explicit poem she'd written, arguing that it had revealed the intensity of her obsession. Over the coming weeks, he promised, the jury would see the full picture of who Diane Downs really was. Defense attorney Jagger countered by acknowledging Diane's emotional struggles, her difficult childhood, her alleged molestation, her pattern of seeking affection through relationships. But none of that, he argued, made her a murderer. He insisted that Diane's account of a stranger on Old Mohawk Road was not a fabrication, and that the state had built its case on assumptions rather than proof. On May 14th, the court recessed so the jury could visit the crime scene. Hughey led them along Old Mohawk Road, pointing out the isolation of the area and describing the darkness that would have surrounded the car on the night of the shooting. He wanted them to feel the remoteness, the vulnerability, the sudden eruption of violence. From there, the jurors were taken to the county impound lot to view the red Nissan Pulsar. The car remained exactly as it had been found, bloodstained and shuttered. Hughey wanted the jury to see the interior for themselves, to understand the physical reality of what had happened inside that small space. It was a sobering start to a trial that would only grow more intense in the weeks ahead. When the trial resumed after the jury's visit to Old Mohawk Road and the impound lot, the state began calling its first witnesses. These early testimonies came primarily from the staff at McKenzie Willamette Hospital. The people who had been there the night the children were brought in, who had seen the aftermath up close. Nurse Rose Martin was among the first to testify. She recalled Diane's demeanour in the emergency department, a memory that had stayed with her. Quote, "She asked how the children were, and I told her the doctors were working on them." End quote. What struck Martin was what came next. Diane laughed, not nervously, not hysterically, but casually, and said, quote, "Only the best for my kids." End quote. Then she laughed again and added, quote, "Well, I have good insurance." End quote. The courtroom reacted with a ripple of discomfort. Martin had no explanation for the comment. She could only report what she had witnessed. Dr. John McKay, the ER physician in charge that night, described the children's injuries in clinical detail. The chest wounds, the frantic efforts to stabilize them, the grim reality of Cheryl's condition. But what he remembered most vividly was Diane's composure. Quote, "She was extremely composed. Unbelievably composed. I couldn't believe she was a family member. There were no tears, no disbelief, no, 'Why did this happen to me?'" End quote. X-ray technician Carlene Elbridge added another detail. While staff worked to save her children, Diane complained about being seen in public without makeup. Elbridge admitted she had never encountered a parent reacting that way under such circumstances. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding another layer to the state's portrait of Diane's behaviour that night. but nothing compared to what came next. The moment everyone had anticipated and dreaded arrived when the prosecution called Christy Downs. The courtroom fell silent as the small, trembling girl was led to the stand. She was pale, visibly frightened, her eyes darting between the judge, the jury, and the mother sitting only a few feet away. Prosecutor Fred Hughey escorted her gently, his expression tight with the weight of what he was asking her to do. It was clear he took no satisfaction in it, but it was necessary. Hughey's demeanour shifted as he questioned Christy. Gone was the sharp, relentless prosecutor. In his place was someone patient, careful, almost fatherly. He offered her tissues when she cried. He paused whenever she needed time. He repeated questions softly so the jury could hear her answers without forcing her to raise her voice. His respect for her was unmistakable, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Hughey began with simple questions: her name, her age, her school, her siblings. Slowly, he guided her toward the night of the shooting. Christy's hands shook, her voice wavered, and at one point she froze, staring at her mother. Hughey waited, letting her gather herself. Just a reminder, Christy Downs was 8 or 9 years old at the time. He asked about the visit to Heather Plaud's house earlier that evening. Christy nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Hughey reassured her, then gently moved forward. I'll next be reenacting what was said in this courtroom. What did your mum do in the car? He asked. Christy swallowed hard. She leaned over to the back seat and shot Danny. A murmur rippled through the courtroom before Judge Foote restored order. What happened then? Hughey asked softly. What happened after Danny got shot? Christy broke down completely. Hughey stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. He didn't push, he waited. When she finally regained her voice, he rephrased the question, easing her towards the truth without forcing it. Do you remember when you got shot? Yeah, she whispered. Who shot you? Christy's answer was quiet but unmistakable. My mum. The words seemed to drain the air from the room. Even seasoned reporters later admitted they'd never experienced a moment like that. Christy's testimony became the emotional centre of the trial. It was the moment the jury would remember long after the lawyers finished arguing and the evidence was packed away. And it was the moment that changed everything. After Christy's testimony, the tone of the trial shifted permanently. The courtroom had already heard weeks of forensic evidence, medical testimony, and accounts of Diane's behaviour, but nothing carried the weight of a child quietly identifying her own mother as the person who pulled the trigger. From that moment on, the rest of the proceedings felt almost secondary. On June 14, 1984, Judge Gregory Foote read the jury's unanimous verdict. Diane Downs was found guilty on all counts. 1 charge of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree, and 2 counts of first-degree assault. Oregon did not have the death penalty at the time, but Judge Foote made his intentions unmistakably clear. He sentenced her to life in prison, plus 50 years for the use of a firearm. Quote, the court hopes the defendant will never again be free. I've come as close to that as possible. End quote. Between the verdict and the sentencing, the court recessed to allow Diane to give birth to her 4th child, a baby girl she named Amy. The pregnancy had been a point of controversy throughout the trial, with many believing Diane had conceived deliberately to sway public sympathy or influence potential jurors. The child's father denied paternity, and Amy was later adopted by a loving family who raised her far from the shadow of her mother's crimes. Diane began serving her sentence at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, but in 1987 she briefly escaped, scaling a fence and disappearing for 10 hours before being recaptured. The escape attempt prompted authorities to transfer her to the maximum security Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. Years later, she was moved again, this time to the Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California, where she remains incarcerated today. Her first parole hearing was scheduled for 2006, though few believe she would ever be released. As for the people whose lives intersected with hers, their past diverged sharply from Diane's. Her former lover, the man prosecutors argued was essential to her motive, remained married to his wife, the two of them choosing to rebuild their lives privately. Steve Downs, Diane's ex-husband, stayed in Oregon, carrying the weight of what had happened, but determined to move forward. The children, Christy and Danny, survived the attack, though the consequences were lifelong. Danny was left paralyzed from the waist down and uses a wheelchair, but those who know him describe him as warm, resilient, and full of humor. Christy, who had once struggled to speak after the stroke she suffered during the shooting, grew into a thoughtful, grounded young woman. Both children eventually found the stability they had been denied in their early years. In 1986, they were adopted by Fred and Joanne Hughey, the very prosecutor who had fought to bring justice for them. The Hugheys provided the safety, consistency, and love the children had never known. Under their care, Christy and Danny were able to heal and to grow. In the months after the verdict, the case didn't fade from public attention. If anything, it grew louder. People had followed the trial on TV, read about it in newspapers, argued about it around their kitchen tables. The idea that a mother could shoot her own children was still something many struggled to wrap their heads around, and Diane's calm interviews, her steady insistence that she was innocent, only made the story more unsettling. She became a kind of national fixation, not because people admired her, but because they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. And Diane didn't shy away from the spotlight. Even from jail, she kept giving interviews, repeating the same story about the bushy-haired stranger, insisting she'd been framed. Then came her escape in 1987. For 10 hours, she was out in the community, and the panic was immediate. Schools locked their doors, people stayed inside, and when she was finally caught, the state didn't take any chances. She was moved out of Oregon altogether, first to a maximum security prison in New Jersey, and later to a women's facility in California, where she remains. Over the years, Diane kept up the same routine: letters to reporters, appeals, and the same story at every parole hearing. She never wavered, never admitted anything, never acknowledged what the evidence showed. And each time she appeared before the parole board, they denied her. Her refusal to take responsibility became the clearest sign that she wasn't willing to change. Meanwhile, the case took on a life of its own. Books were written, documentaries were aired. In 1989, the story was turned into a movie starring Farrah Fawcett, which brought the case to an even wider audience. For many people, that film was their first introduction to Diane Downs, and it cemented her place in true crime history. But for the people who had lived through it, the ones who had sat in that courtroom, or worked in that ER, or carried the investigation for months, it wasn't entertainment. It was something they had to recover from. Christy and Danny, as mentioned before, adopted by Fred and Joanne Hughey, finally found the stability they'd never had as young children. Under the Hugheys' care, they grew up in a home where they were safe, supported, and loved. Christy eventually married and built a quiet, steady life. Danny, despite the paralysis he suffered from the shooting, grew into a warm, resilient young man. Their story didn't end where it began, and that's the part people who followed the case often find the most comforting. Steve Downs eventually remarried and raised some more children, staying out of the spotlight. For him, the case wasn't a headline. It was a loss of a daughter and the near loss of two more. The case of Diane Downs will always be disturbing, always difficult to understand, but its ending isn't really about her. It's about Cheryl, Christy, and Danny. Thank you for listening.